My name is Mark New. I'm based at the African Climate and Development Initiative, and we're very fortunate to have John Ingram here, who's visiting South Africa and to give one of our ACDI webinars for this year. John's based at the University of Oxford, where he's, as it says on the slide, the program leader of the Food Systems Transformation Program. And most importantly, with regards to this talk, he's been working on a major project on resilience of the UK food system, which he's going to be presenting to us at the moment. John's been working in food systems for many, many years. He's a soil scientist originally, but has really been working in this complex interdisciplinary space for, I would imagine, it's nearly 20 years now, something like that. So without much further ado, so we've got lots of time for John to talk and lots of time for questions afterwards. I'm going to hand over to John and ask him to go ahead with his webinar. Thank you.
Hello and good afternoon, everybody. It's a delight to be here, and I hope what I have to present will be of interest and will lead to some further discussions. So what I'm proposing to talk about is what we call food system thinking, but particularly in relation to enhancing food system resilience. And there's a lot of discussion around food systems at the minute. There's a huge amount of discussion about resilience. So bring them all together and we've got a rich conversation. What I'd like to start with is just thinking about just get this thing to click down, excuse me. To ask the question, what do we actually want from our food systems? Obviously, the food security output, is paramount, often captured in these three major components, and stability across the piece. But if one thinks for a moment, what else do we want from our food systems? One can come up with quite a long list of other types of societal interests: health and wealth and employment, landscape value, animal welfare, and all sorts of other things. So we're actually demanding an awful lot from our food system. If we just start to unpack the food system, the term, first by recognizing these range of different food system activities, as we call them. These are not alien to any of you, I know, but the fact is that they're all existing. One point to note of the diagram is that all the words end in ing, which is just a little reminder that they're all to do with doing things that we do. So there's a whole range of activities with interactions, as you can see with the arrows. These activities are undertaken by a wide range of actors or people, to use a simpler term, and you can recognize that list. We are, of course, on that list. We are all consumers. But of course, so is everybody else on that list. They're all consumers. And one of the points is that all of these people are influenced all the time by this wide range of drivers or environments: the social situation, the economic situation, the environmental conditions, etc., etc. No surprises there. But something to remember is that all of these actors have a wide range of motives. And for most of the people on the diagram, ourselves apart as consumers, it's essentially to have a job. One can argue that the person driving the McDonald's truck isn't particularly interested in what's in the back of the truck per se, other than at the end of the week they get a wage packet. So what is the motivation across the piece? Another thing to recognize, of course, is the material change. As material moves from the left to the right, it undergoes change. We radically change it. We can make it, we can enrich it from a nutrition point of view. We can make it less healthy. We can make it more healthy. But it's absolutely important that this happens, because I would much rather eat bread than wheat. And one can argue, and some people do, that the farm, that the fisher folk, the livestock rangers, don't actually produce food, they produce biomass. And then the food sector turn it from biomass into something that you and I would call food. Just think about that for a moment. You may not agree. But it does make the point that there is this massive material change, and oh, so important is it. And again, with that becomes the livelihood and the value addition. And so all the livelihoods embedded across the piece are part of the economic machine of the nations, and they're very important. And they contribute hugely to the wealth and enterprise sector of not the individual, but also the nations itself. So that's that. All of this, of course, remind, is modified by these environments, the way those activities are undertaken by the actors. So that's what we do. Now, let's think about some of the outcomes of what we do and the food security outcomes. Here's the definition from FAO, you're probably familiar with. It's used very widely. Lots of people subscribe to it, and I found it very helpful in my work, providing you read it very carefully and analyze each and every word. What we've done is to see how these three major circles, the components, as I call them, all of which have to be stable over time to some degree, how they are actually captured as a researchable entity. The definition at the top is more of an aspiration, and it's very difficult to research that per se. But if we break down these major components into affordability, allocation, and preference, all of which are important in terms of food access, who gets to eat what, when and where, is it something we like, can we afford it? The utilization is, of course, very important from a nutritional point of view. Has it got the right nutritional value? But let's not forget the social function that food has and its importance in cultural identity and religious festival and things like that. And of course, it has to be safe. And then for availability, well, of course, there is the primary production, whether it's from the field or the ocean or the forest. But then it requires distribution. It has to be moved around and exchanged, whether it's myself in a market or whether it's on the futures markets at the Chicago Stock Exchange. The notion of exchange is crucial. But these 9 bullet points aren't random, because they are actually distilled from the definition above, from the aspiration, and turn that definition into a collection of researchable entities that collectively can be brought together to address the food security situation and question. So what is the current situation? Well, 7.8 billion or so of us on the planet at the moment. Of that, in excess of 0.8 billion, approaching 1 billion, hungry, don't have enough calorie, certainly insufficient nutrients. We're also aware of at least 3 billion of us who aren't actually hungry, but we have insufficient nutrients. And then there is 2.5–3 billion of us with excess calories, including many of whom have insufficient nutrients as well. And so this triple burden of malnutrition, as it's been termed, is the current, very well recognized situation. And it can exist at the household level down to the family, as well, of course, at a national level. And this begs the question, so how many of us are in the sweet spot? And I argue that less than half the global population actually has a good and healthy diet. So my question is, what determines which circle anybody falls in? There's a huge debate, a huge legacy of agricultural research to address food insecurity primarily. But let's think about what determines the immediate. What are the constraints on our dietary choice? These are the constraints that determine which of those circles we fall in. And you see the very same words in italics that we were looking at a few moments ago, but some other things like skill and cultural norms begin to apply. And these things determine the consumption by the subpopulations. Affordability is part set by the price, and the final price at the shop, where a shop could just be an informal duka or a market or a major supermarket, whatever, is set by this range of activities, the processing, packaging, trading, etc., all of that economic machine that lies between the farm gate and my plate. And all of those actors ultimately get their material from the farm or from the ocean, as I say, and those actors are dependent ultimately on the productivity or the diversity and quality of the natural resource base. And their efforts set the basic nutrient quality and quantity and price at the farm. So this diagram is constructed to address the question, what determines what we eat, not what determines what we grow. There are, of course, massive feedbacks, and it is a true system because there are feed forwards, feedbacks. And all of this, as we've said, is governed and influenced both forward and backwards by these environments. Something else we know is that the strength of the food environment, as it's called, increases dramatically as we go up this diagram. So the determinants of choice include the signaling that comes to me in terms of advertising or proximity of a fast food outlet, etc., etc. So when one's dealing with the food environment, in that guise, one needs to really be focusing on how it's affecting dietary choice. We also know that the current food system activities are impacting our global environment. The data is probably not news to any of you listening, but about a big UNEP International Resources Panel report a few years ago came out with these pretty staggering figures, frankly, particularly the marine resources. And in addition to these quantified environmental impacts of the whole food sector, we also have pollution and litter and plastics and chemicals and all these sorts of things we know. And then just approaching a year ago, there was a big paper in Nature Food, which actually did a very thorough analysis and made the statement that the food system overall responsible for perhaps a third of our total greenhouse gas emissions. I'd hitherto been working on a figure of about 20 to 25%. So, in addition to environmental concerns and food insecurity and overconsumption, we've also got a host of ethical concerns about the food system. You can read the list there. You can add your own to the bottom. You could rearrange it. You could cross things out. It very much depends on your worldview. While one can measure and quantify soil loss, no one would really disagree that that's happening and that it's important. But the degree to which each and every one of us puts animal welfare on the list is a very personal decision. And then, of course, we've got very, very current concerns about animal-human interactions. The diagram just shows the overlap between human populations, wildlife populations, and managed livestock, and the sorts of diseases that are occurring in those overlaps. Of course, we've got antimicrobial resistance, which is very major now and is a leading cause of death as the microbes become resistant to our armory of medicines. And then the increasing risk of rapid changes at the animal-human interface. And we don't need to look outside the window to remember what's going on here today over the last 2 years. So there's a lot of interactions to think about in the food system. What we need to do is balance our activities, the diagram at the top, the what we do, with the what we want, but actually the what we get. And some of the gets are positive and some of the gets are negative. We get employment and wealth. We get degrees of food security. We also get a very large environmental footprint. And so immediately this is saying we're dealing with a trade-off situation, and that any intervention in the food sector has got to be very cognizant of the potential trade-offs. But we also need to remember there are synergies through careful management, and that's the area to exploit. So that's today. What's coming down the track, and more to the point, for whom? We've been aware for a long time, certainly over the last 10 years, the concerns have increased about these changes in these basic drivers: demography, geopolitics, climate and weather. It's been on the agenda for some decades, certainly. But then about perhaps a decade ago, certainly in the UK, research community, this new agenda began to emerge, which isn't really just about sustainability, and it needs much more forward thinking and the problem of handling uncertainties. And then all of a sudden, kapow, we had a major shock come through, certainly the UK food system, but the ramifications across Europe and indeed worldwide. And of course, we've got the epidemic still ongoing, but hopefully beginning to tail off in some parts of the world. What's going to happen next? How do we prepare for it? Just thinking of the nature of risks, you may have been seeing these World Economic Forum global risk reports over the recent years, and you can see the way the agenda has been changing. But in terms of the likelihood of the risk, extreme weather is still top of the tree, climate action failure as number 2, and natural disasters and various things like that. If one, however, thinks in terms of impact, here we see an interesting story that only 3 or 4 years ago, weapons of mass destruction was still top place and had been since the beginning of this series of reports. But it was replaced by climate action failure and then knocked down again in 2021 because of infectious disease came in as an impact. And that was the recognition a year ago. This year's report, just out, identified the most severe risks over the next 10 years, and you can see 1, 2, and 3, climate action failure, extreme weather, biodiversity loss. And the geo-economic confrontation, in which one could include WMD, is knocked right the way down to 10th position. So the realization that climate, environment, biodiversity, etc., and the cohesion, social cohesion and livelihoods are all wrapped up together as major risks are at the very core of food system analysis. In the UK, we launched a programme back in 2016. It had £15 million funding from research councils and Scottish Government, and gave rise to 13 collaborative projects, each of which looked at various elements of production or supply chain or consumption patterns. And the programme has just come to a formal close at the end of 2021, although we've obviously got some ongoing work. More recently, UK government put out a big thing in relation to COVID. The long-term food system issues are the concern, and hence the need to how to build resilience to possible future shocks, right in the heart of UK government departments. So it is now a wake-up call. You may be familiar with some of the work by Ariella Helfgott, but she had a paper a few years ago which tremendously helpful in getting the conversation organized. Let's start with 4 questions. Let's say, okay, we want to talk about resilience, but resilience of what precisely? And resilience to what? Fairly obvious, you might think. But then the third interesting question is resilience from whose perspective? Is it from the perspective of a researcher or a policymaker or a food system actor, a farmer or a McDonald's truck driver? You know, from whose perspective should we be having the conversation? And then, of course, over what time period are we trying to enhance resilience? And it's been fundamentally valuable having these 4 questions on the table all the time, because until we agree the answers to them, we really don't know what the conversation is about. There is an assumption we know. These answers set a boundary, and the boundary definition, the agreeing the boundary, is really fundamental to the food system discussion, particularly in relation to resilience. So of what? So are we interested in the resilience of the food system activities, the resilience of the farming, the resilience of wholesale or retailing, the resilience of consuming, and let's call that the functioning of the system? Or are we interested in the food system outcomes, the what we get, the health, the wealth, the food security, the environmental condition, which is what we're calling the function? So the first thing from the 5-year program was an agreement. We would clearly separate the food system activities, the what we do, with the food system outcomes, the what we get. And that we would refer to the activities as the functioning of the system and the outcomes of the function of the system. And we argue that from a societal point of view, we're really interested in the outcomes. The black box at the top could remain a black box if you're really not interested in how your food gets on your plate, providing it gets there. So we focus on the outcomes. To what? Stresses and shocks. The difference between stresses and shocks, often captured in these cartoons, work from the Foresight for Food program that we coordinate out of our group in Oxford. The notion of steam trains coming down the track, you can see it coming down the track, it's getting bigger and bigger. It's not a surprise, it's worrisome, it's getting more strong. A stress or a shock, which is unimagined, black swan, completely unexpected. And on the left, there's a list of some of the stresses and steam trains that we're aware of at the moment. And one can say on the right is a list of the black swans, because we just don't know what they are. However, to be a little bit more sensible, that you can have a shock from things which are not conceptually unheard of, but we just don't know if they're going to happen or when they're going to happen. And we might even call those grey swans. So the difference between the stress and the shock is important. From whose perspective? Is it from the perspective of the food system actors, all the people doing the activities? Or is it from somebody else's perspective? Is it from the perspective of a policy community, or from the private sector, or from society at large? So that needs to be discussed and agreed. And then the difference between a shock producing what often the industry refer to as an interruption, could be a short-term event. It's important. If your business is just-in-time groceries, your concern is an IT malfunction. It would really mess up your delivery system. If you're interested in a particular agricultural activity, you might be very worried about a hailstorm taking out your crop, for instance. As opposed to a disruption, which is normally due to a stress, for instance, energy prices or change in dietary preferences. So you can see the difference, I hope, between the shock and the stress. They require very different management techniques to mitigate, as we'll see. So we've got our 4 questions of what, to what, from whose perspective, and over what time period. And so then it says, so what do you want to do? Well, if we want to resist disruption to our existing food system outcomes, because we like what we have, we want to have a robustness strategy. We want to make the system strong so that it is robust to shock and stress and does not get interrupted. If, however, we're conscious that it will be interrupted, but we want to get back to what we used to have because we really like it, sort of bounce back notion after the shock or the stress, we want to return to the pre-existing, I should say, food system outcomes. And that we would call recovery. There's a third approach, which is what we've called reorientation, where we, society, actually accept alternative food system outcomes before or after a disruption. So we accept that we will have different diets, or we will accept that we will be farming in a different way, or we accept that we will be food processing and waste management in a different way. And that is a tremendously powerful way forward. Whichever of these 3 R's, as we call them, we're engaged in, they all involve adaptation, adapting the food system activities, because we need to change the way we're doing the activities. We adapt the food system activities. So we adapt the activities to from robustness and recovery to maintain or return to the outcomes, or for reorientation, we adapt the food system activities to transform the food system outcomes into something else. Robustness, a couple of just examples to give an idea of what this might mean. So we've got a situation where we've got the risk of flood onto grazing land. So a robustness strategy would be to adapting the defense building activities by ever higher concrete walls rather than using earth bunds. So that can, of course, enhance the resilience, but it's not sustainable because you can't go on making the wall forever higher. From a recovery point of view, you can adapt your pumping activities, and my example is you'd use diesel pumps instead of a water mill to clear the water as quickly as possible after these ever-increasing floods. So you get back to your grazing land. Again, it enhances your resilience, but it's not sustainable. Whereas with the reorientation notion, we're adapting the consumption patterns, where we're saying to ourselves, well, we don't actually need so much product from grazing land. And we quite like the idea of some wetland biodiversity. Let's accept that that's going to be our future. And the point about reorientation is it can both enhance the resilience of the system because we're not demanding so much product from the unit area, but also that enhances the sustainability because it's adding some of the environmental benefits. A very simple hypothetical example, hopefully just to better explain the 3 R's. But the important thing here is that the degree of adaptation of the food system activity will determine the degree of transformation of the food system outcome for the reorientation. And if one's looking for a major transformation of outcome, it will generally require a major adaptation of the activity. So we're going to have to do something very differently in order to get something different out of it. Adapt the food system activities, do the doing words differently, fairly straightforward. Reorganize the food environments, the food system environments, move into the social, the policy, the market areas. What can we do to improve market structure? What can we do with food processing technologies, etc.? Reorient our views of food system outcomes. And here we see a report from the Inter-Academies panel a few years ago, a partnership, requiring a radical transformation of the system. They say we've got to have a radical transformation of the system. But I argue, well, I ask, what does that actually mean? What does food system transformation really mean? What are we actually trying to transform? A very recent paper, just in Nature Food Correspondence, achieving transformation, well, the headline, the urgency of food system transformation is now irrefutable. Again, calling for food system transformation. But what does that mean? Whatever it is, it's going to require a major shift in mindset, particularly regarding the present versus the possible versus the status quo. We reorient our thinking to a different set, accepting a different set of outcomes. Why is it important? On this cartoon, I've just plotted on the x-axis the number of billions of people on the planet at any particular year, and on the y-axis the calorific consumption, 2000 being recommended calorific intake. And the grey line, sloping grey line, is in the year 2000, had about 6 billion people. Just about 1 billion were hungry. They were below the line. On the left, we had 1 billion with 1.5 billion with too much. Above the line, and the green is in the sweet spot. Here we are this year, we've got 7.8 billion. We've still got approaching 1 billion people hungry below the line. We've got 2.5 billion of us with too much calorie. This is just calorie, by the way, it's not full nutrients. Go forward a decade, we are going to see another 1.5 billion people moving into the middle class. And when people change their economic circumstance, diet changes. This has been very well recognized in a number of papers. And so the prospect of the extra billion or so people, where over 1.5 of those will be moving up the economic ladder, which is of course a good thing, will mean their dietary consumption changes and the calorific intake will go up. And if we extrapolate, just linearly extrapolate with the cartoon, when we've got 9.5 billion people, the fear is there will be well over 1 billion people hungry for a number of reasons, not least environmental stress, and the projection of over half the global population having excess calorie. What's from a food system outcome? Environmental consequences of meeting this demand under our current system and consumption trends are indeed dire. Recall that the area under these curves is the amount of calorie that will need to be produced to satisfy that demand if it happens. So under the black line, the 2022, we've already seen the environmental and health consequences. You can imagine what would happen under the other. Already the triple burden of malnutrition, including the overconsumption, of course, contributing over 10% of loss to GDP globally. And just for one disease, the type 2 diabetes is already costing about $1 trillion a year in just management of the disease, and the number of diabetics is anticipated to double over the next decade. So, big challenge. For those who don't have enough, for the hungry, there is still the vital and moral imperative to help meet demand. And this is, of course, the job of the development agencies very largely. But my concern is the left-hand side. How on earth do we not have that curve happen? How do we better manage demand so that these curves are reversed and we are able to pull down the overall calorie consumption and also use our agricultural harvest for ways other than biofuels, for ways other than feeding to livestock, for reducing the waste and the loss on farm, etc. So there's a big job to do on the demand side. So here's the challenge: achieving food security for a growing, wealthier, urbanizing population while minimizing environmental problems and maintaining vibrant livelihoods, but against this background of further challenges. It's a tall ask. It's a tall ask. How do we do it? Where do we intervene? On the right, we've got our cartoons we've been looking at, the activities leading to the outcomes, the what we do and the what we get, all modified by these food system drivers. We have the major socioeconomic drivers of the planet, the demography, the cultural context, etc., leading over the last 50 years definitely to environmental drivers, some natural drivers, of course, as well. But the point is that it's not one of these drivers interacting with one of the aspects of the food sector. It's the interaction between the driver set and how that puts the overall stress and opportunity on the system. So what we want to do is transform the outcomes. We want to have better animal welfare. We want to have reduced food insecurity. We want to have cleaner rivers. We want to have more fair and just workplace. We want to transform those outcomes. That means we need to adapt our activities, and the activities don't just spontaneously adapt, but as a result to a signal. And that means we need to reorganize the signal, the environments, so that we can better tune the adaptation pathways of the activities so that they lead to transformed outcomes. When that happens, and normally for a socioeconomic feedback, whether it's better nutrition or better political stability, whatever, there is, of course, always an environmental feedback. And if your agenda is an environmental agenda and you want to improve the water quality by changing the activities, the certainty is that there will be a socioeconomic consequence as well. And this food system dynamic, it's a very simple diagram, but it captures some of the major elements, are really important in identifying what are the drivers and feedbacks, where are the trade-offs and synergies, where are the aims and the challenges of the actors and the society within whom they work, and where is the intervention point for policy and practice. So why is it so hard to make progress? Well, we've got this complex adaptive system, a set of dynamic activities with actors engaged, wide range of socioeconomic and environmental drivers, but here we get to the nub of it, a wide range of power and vested interest across the piece and fragmented governance. And alas, we're still pretty much stuck in silo approaches with a generally poor ability to deal with the complexity. However, there are many plausible futures. There are many opportunities for better cooperation between actors. It will require negotiation. There are many policy and financial, technical options for change. What we need to do is understand how best to use these opportunities that are presented in enhancing the governance of the system so that we are able to deliver better outcomes. So just to conclude, some summary messages. Strategies to enhance food system resilience need to be context specific. These are some messages coming from our program. No way is there a silver bullet that will suit all. You've got to really understand the context, and you have to answer those 4 questions to be absolutely precise what we're talking about. Sustainability and resilience are not the same. Often they're confused, but it is possible that they can be synergistically managed within the reorientation strategy. The robustness and recovery strategies are ultimately not sustainable, but the reorientation, reorienting of views of what we expect and demand from the food system is a way forward. And the combination of these 3 R's are used in practice, of course, and how we combine and which bit of the resilience strategy we use will really require this wide range of actions, interrelated actions in policy and practice. These are just 3 summary messages. The report from the program is available with a lot more. So let me close there and say thank you for staying with me, and very happy to have some conversations. Nice to see many friends on the wire already, and others I don't know who I look forward to meeting. So thank you. I hope that was of interest and open to we got 20 minutes or so discussion.
Great, thanks, John. I'm going to ask people, if you can, to raise your hands and speak. If you're having trouble with sound, then please just pop a message in the chat and we'll try to verbalize your question. So I see we have Steve Arawolo with his hand up. So Steve, do you want to go ahead first? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mark, and thank you so much, John. Yeah, so I'd like to know, what's the nexus between food system activities and food value chain?
Oh, you could argue it's the same thing. The activities in my diagrams were largely in a chain. Of course, it's not a perfect chain, but you could use those phrases interchangeably. The food system activities have been captured in a diagram in a chain. There's a lot of feedback and feed forward up and down along the chain. Is that okay?
So pretty much they are the same. Are they
yes,
the same?
I mean, yeah. Well, the value chain is the chain of activities that add value to the basic agricultural product and deliver it to my plate.
Okay.
That is the very same set of activities. The important thing, Steve, is that those are all related to the activities, not the outcomes. And it's very important in our work to differentiate the activities from the outcomes.
Okay. Thank you, John.
I see Catherine. Can't hear you, Catherine. Let's come back to you in a minute, okay? Or bang something in the chat. Okay, well, I won't forget. Ralph, is that right? Shall I just go with it? Ralph, I just see your name. Hi, hello, Ralph.
Hi, not Ralph. I'm sitting in Ralph's class.
Okay. Hello, somebody sitting in Ralph's class.
Hi, my name is Nantituzela. I just wanted to ask, I just often feel like there's a lot of pressure that's placed on policy and somehow responding with policy and governance. And so far, especially in the environmental sector, there hasn't been much progress that can effectively be quantified to the ability to respond to changing the systems around how we are ensuring that climate change does not catch up with us to the point where we can't effectively bring in food systems that are equitable, etc. So I'm struggling with kind of putting hopes on that without also knowing what's the other possibility.
Well, I mean, it's a huge question. Of course, policy isn't just policy of central government or district government. It's policy of industry sectors. It's policy of NGOs, policy of civil society groups. So there's a big discussion as to how these different monocentric or polycentric governance systems interact. Raising awareness, I think, is probably the best thing to do. And goodness me, I don't know how I answer the specific question for South Africa, but the point you make is absolutely right, and it's a feature of the nature of the wicked problems and the super wicked problems that food insecurity is that time is running out, and as with the climate agenda, time is running out, and we really need to be able to reorganize our policy domain so that it is more fit for purpose and better tuned to the challenges ahead and indeed today. Huge question. I hope that was some sort of an answer. I see Keith Phiri.
Thank you so much, John, for such an insightful presentation. I wanted to find out how the pandemic has actually transformed or changed the food systems vis-a-vis the climate inaction that we are seeing, particularly in Africa. What is the extent of the damage to the food systems in the context of the pandemic and the climate inaction, particularly globally in general and also specifically in Southern Africa? Thank you.
Well, goodness, another excellent question. Certainly where I come from, the pandemic has kind of been the dominant discussion. We had COP that kept the climate agenda on the table. Had it not been for COP, certainly in the UK, I don't think we would have had anything like enough discussion on the climate agenda. But the pandemic has interrupted the food sector big time. There are those who argue that the food system has been remarkably resilient. It just depends on where you look. And if you look under the surface of society, you find very large pockets of society in my country, in the UK, who have been very seriously marginalized by it, either directly because of access or because the food value chain, as Steve was using the phrase, has been interrupted because key aspects of that chain have lost workforce. And it is a point about the system that it depends on the system working as a system. And if you take out the logistics, however good your agriculture and however good your dietary guidelines, if you take out the logistics, then the system fails to function. And it's the poorer, the less equipped, the more disenfranchised sectors of our global society who are likely to have been the hardest hit. But you're absolutely right to bring the interaction with other major challenges like climate change. One shouldn't just think about food as food, but think about it in the context of environment and in the context of livelihoods and business. And, the enterprises that are the food system, whether they're big or small, whether you love them or hate them, they're important because they turn the wheat into bread. Oh, I see Hallie.
Oh, I think somebody was ahead of me.
Let's see. Sorry, I didn't. It's a bit hard to see on my screen.
I don't.
Who's ahead? But anyway, Hallie, you're there now. So
Okay. I'll just be, I was interested in this reorienting of the food system and food system transformation and the role of values and the need for kind of a fundamental, potentially a fundamental shift in what we think of as the value of food. Yes. From kind of an economic to a broader conceptualization of values. Yep. And just wondered if you had any thoughts about this idea of greater uncertainty kind of permeating the food system. And do you see that as a trigger for a kind of broader shift in values across food system actors?
Well, I think it certainly should be, and it needs to be encouraged. Yes, just to clarify the terminology we are using, our proposition is that one needs to adapt the activities to transform the outcomes. Now, I know there's a great debate about food system transformation, but the question I posed on one of the slides is, what does that actually mean? And what are we actually trying to transform? It doesn't satisfy me just say we're trying to transform the system. If I say I'm trying to transform the outcome, so I'm transforming state A, poor animal welfare, to state B, good animal welfare, I understand what I'm talking about. I'm transforming an outcome from state A to state B. To do that, we need to adapt the activity. And to come to your point about valuing food, not just in financial terms, but valuing it as valuing the food system as an entry point to addressing the challenge of climate, addressing the challenge of unfair and inequitable livelihoods, addressing the challenge of biodiversity loss. It's an entry point that we should all get on board, particularly from the policy in the various forms I've been discussing, to see how to harmonize policy, to have it less fragmented, so that the food system is seen as an entry point to bettering society's situation. It's all I can say, Hallie, but the recognition of the need to value food, not only in its physical sense, but in its meta sense, its role in cultural identity or religious ceremony and this sort of thing, is equally important in food security definition as the new, has it got enough calcium in it? Great, I wasn't expecting anything other than a 100-mile-an-hour question from you, Hallie. And I think I'm going to get one from Angela as well. Oh my goodness. Okay, over to you.
John, before we move to Angela, there are a couple of questions in the chat.
Oh yes, far away.
So Catherine Brody, Catherine asks quite a specific question. What is your take on regenerative agriculture, such as no-till cropping, high-density grazing, etc., in the future of food security, and specifically in reorientating our thinking towards food security?
Well,
John, can I interrupt you for 1 second? Because I was going to build on that question, and I will not give you a 100-mile-an-hour one if you let me bundle the two.
All right. Well, can I, if you want to
I do. It's about regenerative. What I'm saying is, you and I wrote a piece about negotiating food systems resilience, and in many ways, we were talking about the role of business in achieving this resilience and building it up. It came out just a few weeks before Walmart, the largest food retailer in the world, committed to its supply chains delivering on regenerative agriculture by 2030. So I'd really love to hear your response to this regenerative question with regard to the role of business in negotiating resilience.
Well, I mean, regenerative agriculture, by its words, apply to the primary production bit. Now, the degree to which an organization like Walmart will demand that its supply comes from regenerative agriculture really means that one's talking about applying the concept to the system. Now, coming from soil science, as Mark introduced me, I have a certain view on the term. A lot of what's being put up now as regenerative agriculture has just been good soil husbandry for decades. And it's important to recognize that words come and go, but practice often is fairly constant, and the need for what we do is constant. So I'm not belittling the phrase, and I think it's very good that people are using it, but just be aware that it's not in itself brand new. It has of course it has a role, and I would just put it slightly broader. Better agroecology management, in the strict sense of the word agroecology, not the modern sense of the word agroecology, the way that the system works from an ecological point of view in the agricultural context, getting a better handle on that is nothing but good sense. Better soil management, better management of the soil biology, big black box stuff still, but huge opportunities. But I wouldn't say regenerative agriculture is the answer. It's part of a set of interventions and new thinking, which in a way maps back to Hallie's question and points about, how do we value things? And if Walmart thinks its customers will value something which has got a label on saying comes from regenerative agriculture, and it will have the footfall in Walmart increase, then that's the game they're playing. If it actually means that there is better soil management and less erosion, etc., that's nothing but a good thing. Was that the question from Catherine in the chat? I wasn't sure.
Great, yes.
Good. Well,
I see Catherine is unmuted. I don't know if we can still hear her though.
Good.
There is another question from the chat from Peter Johnson.
Peter.
Which relates to access. He asks, in your opinion, how do we facilitate access for poor people who cannot afford to grow, in brackets, trade or produce food?
Well, if they unfortunately don't have the ability to grow, purchase or trade, strikes me the only answer is a social safety net. I can't think of any other response. Either they are helped or they are not. Access, of course, isn't only affordability, but in the diagrams I were using, there is the physical, social and economic access in the FAO definition, but the access has got to be preference, as affordability and allocation. And I think really it's the allocation word that pertains, Peter, here. And who gets to eat what? You may remember on the graph I showed of that sort of stepping up over the decades. Down at the bottom right, I said, for those who don't have enough, we have to meet their demand. And the image I used was a refugee situation in somewhere or other. And that was an allocation issue. Those people had been allocated a certain amount of food for the week. They didn't have ability to farm, they didn't have the ability to buy, and they didn't have the ability to trade. A social safety net for that family stepped in. I mean, what can we say, Peter?
Yeah, thanks for that, John. It's just, in your graph, you kept showing that gap on the right where people were not getting enough calorific nutrition, yes. and I didn't see anything that specifically addressed how that could be rebalanced so there could be an equitable distribution and access made available to those people.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a big debate about literally rebalancing. Practically, it's very difficult to shift food around in the necessary amounts, but one can rebalance in a slightly different way. And one of the reasons for the need to manage demand is that if we don't, the environmental degradation that lies ahead will hit the poor and marginalized first and hardest. And so I can put an argument that in order to enhance reduce the food insecurity for the people on the right, we should be putting all our attention on the left-hand side of the graph, or anyway, a hell of a lot more. And that's really contrary to the aid concept. The aid concept is that you address the problem, you don't address the symptom.
Yeah, and then you come to wastage, which is another issue in another day.
That's all part of managing demand. Reduce wastage. Anything to pull the demand function down. Eat differently, reduce wastage, stop putting 50% of cereal, 30% of cereal into cows, reduce the 20% of cereal that goes into biofuel. Not completely, but just reduce it. And anything we can reduce collectively will make a big impact on that demand curve. But I'm really wedded to this notion of the need to manage demand is the challenge of the decade. The need to meet demand for the hungry will continue, I am afraid, and will increase. But the need to manage demand is the challenge we all face, and we're not good at it. Political death, apart from anything, to stand up and say, eat less. A good question, Peter, to the nub of the issue. We've got a couple of minutes left. And
I had a question. So it gets back to the work you're doing. Can you mute yourself? Yeah, okay. So John and I are sharing a room. So there's a bit of feedback every now and again. The work you're doing in the UK, and whether, number one, you thought that the UK system wasn't structured towards what we want it to be in terms of the outcomes. So was there anything emerging saying that what people articulated the outcomes to be was sort of different to what the food system is delivering? And then I was also interested, when you talked a lot about all the possible ways one could, the leverage points and the ways one could change, and whether there was anything within the UK food system that came out as sort of critical entry points to shifting it in ways that that would make it sort of more fit for purpose, if you like. So essentially going from your theoretical framing into actually using the UK as an example, what needs to change? Yeah.
The question was, what are the goals we want? I think those are the sort of obvious things. We want, good livelihoods, good health, good environment. For particularly when you think about the societal segmentation and who gets the good stuff and who doesn't, who lives in the good place and who doesn't. So there's the big sort of social and political debate about leveling up, as our wonderful Prime Minister has called it. The intervention points very much are context specific. And one of the challenges we unearthed with the £15 million programme, how to enhance the resilience of the UK food system, is that it's very difficult to do without breaking it down into bits. And so the 13 projects that were funded were all bits and pieces of it. How do you bring it together to actually answer the exam question? And that rather depends on the bits and pieces you have on the table. But you have to say, in the pig sector, how do you enhance the resilience of the pig sector? Well, it's a question of thinking about the demand function as well as the supply function. So some of the research was looking at animal welfare, some of it was looking at markets, and others were looking at government policies. And so you need to look at all the different tools you have in the toolkit that pertain to the issue. There isn't a toolkit for the UK food system. There are toolkits for lots of bits of it. And the real challenge is how you pull it together. But the point, your first question, I think, is the key, that we need to agree what the goal is. And then you say, well, what's better and for whom? And the problem with any intervention is that there are always winners and losers, and that the unforeseen consequences are what come back to bite us. And that's why the system approach is essential, because it identifies the feedbacks and the feed forwards. It really is the entry point to analysis, but then you need to answer these 4 questions so that we know what we're talking about. And it's much easier to talk about the resilience of the UK pig industry than it is to talk about the resilience of the UK food system, But at least if we're clear that those are the two issues on the table, we're not assuming we're talking about the same thing.
Okay, great, thanks. So we're at on the hour now, so I think we do need to pull it to a close. I'd like to first of all, thank John for giving this talk. I think John's available for any follow-up inquiries. And if you can't get hold of him, just get hold of myself or Michelle, who's hosting the event, and we can pass on the contact details. The recording will be available pretty soon of the webinar, and there's been a request, John, whether people can access the slides. So if that's the case, then I'll get those from you and we can make them available. Yeah. So yeah, thanks very much, John, and thanks everybody for attending, and enjoy your last few days in the Western Cape.